And today I'm going to talk about where our reform measures should be reformed. And this is for me more like a story, a narrative, in the sense that maybe the past 10 years or so, I've been involved in various initiatives at several universities. And I've always wondered why they never turn out quite the way they were supposed to turn out. Sort of like Kuamana Sensei was just talking about there. Sometimes it's something like Corona that just throws all your plans to the side. A lot of times, though, it seems to be that there's something wrong with what we're doing. So I thought, well, I'll think about this. I'll read about this. And I had during Corona a lot of time to read, a lot of time to think. And so I came up with some ideas, and I'd like to explain those to you. And first of all, I'd like you to know that the concept that initiatives and reform efforts go wrong is basically universal. Okay. Any higher education system in the world seems to have problems with this. This is from talking about higher education research. And this Malcolm Tite was suggesting that, well, everything you read in higher education research says that everything's going great. And why is it that all the teachers know that it's not going great in that situation? Well, that's sort of what he says here. Logic, anecdotal evidence, and personal experience all suggest that whatever we're reading in the higher education research is not a representative sample. Many, perhaps most, initiatives fail. And he talks more about this, but that's where I wanted to start. And then I wanted to show you that this is not something that's new, not because of absolutely neoliberal policies, although that probably could be involved. This has been going on for years, and we just never really look at it. So in 2005, so about 15, 20 years ago, Treller said higher education initiatives are often ineffective, misconceived, or even counterproductive. And by the way, these are all pretty famous higher education researchers. And if we go back even further in sort of a classic work, you can see from the title in 1986, Great Expectations and Mixed Performance. You can pretty much guess what the book is about. And one of their arguments is that a major problem with implementation of reforms is that higher education ignores how successful change is actually implemented. Okay, so we have that, and we also have, I've tried to throw a little bit of Japanese research in here too. And this is from someone named Furui, who actually quite an interesting book. I just happened upon it in the library. And he notes that Japanese efforts at reform are farcical and end up being a waste of time and effort. And that universities thus, and this is my translation, but it's what he said, they lose sight of their true purpose. But he's very negative about this. And one thing I found along the way, this sort of explains it to me. It's like everybody thinks, okay, we're going to do all these reforms and everything's going to be great. And it's sort of like this Sidney Harris cartoon, that somewhere for these reforms to be successful, there has to be some kind of miracle that happens. And that miracle never happens. And we need to ask why this miracle never happens. So I came up with 6 examples. These aren't the only examples. I tried to get away from individual, micro-level things, such as, well, that center director is clearly inadequate. He does a sloppy job. It's his fault. And I tried to steer away from the macro-level things that really we have no control over. Okay. So I went for 6 examples that I think some of these you will be able to change if you're careful. You can plan through these, and maybe our reform measures would be more successful. So I'll go through them one by one, but these are the 6 that I mentioned. These aren't the only ones. And by the way, I also think that maybe much of what I'm saying today will depend on where you work, if you feel this or you don't feel it. I think probably teachers who work at national universities feel it a bit more strongly than people who work at private universities. But again, I can't talk about the entire higher education system in Japan because there's so many different varieties here. So, dangers of 6-year midterm planning. Okay. First of all, one US researcher basically says strategic planning really doesn't work. Okay, this is a pretty famous book also. And he says strategic planning doesn't work well enough to be worth all the time and money universities spend on it. So maybe it works sometimes, but it's certainly not worth all the effort that we put into it. And he gives 8 ways that strategic planning can fail. They are kind of interesting, so I'll go through them here, I guess. Little advice on how to plan, so we just aren't planning correctly. Overly generic mission statements, common in Japan, I think. Limited options, mission creep, the planning fallacy, meaning that if you plan it, it will happen. The need to measure the unmeasurable. Shallow SWOT is in strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis. And just ideal never meets the reality. So these are things that he mentioned. If we go to Japanese views, I'll just read one. Koike over here says that, well, problems with mid-range planning included inordinate investment in time and effort and a reduction in employee satisfaction and motivation. He wasn't just talking about universities. He was comparing universities and corporations, basically. But he said they're very similar in this way. This is a point where I would like to give just a few anecdotal stories from my own experience, which I put at the top there. That's why I was at the top there to remind myself I'm supposed to say this. SDGs, everybody knows what it is, Sustainable Development Goals here. So one reason I think midterm planning doesn't work is because it's kind of wrong, actually. Midterm planning at the university I'm mainly talking about is 6 years. Okay? And I was pulled in and asked, well, Ken, in English curriculum, can you put SDGs into our English curriculum? And I said, yeah, okay. I don't really want to do it, but if this is what the university really wants, we're sort of doing a lot of that already. We can do that. I can have it ready for you in 6 months. Or if you want to give us a little more time, 1.5 years. And he said, no, I want it in 6 years. So that's a problem when you think about it. This is why strategic planning doesn't work. If this is some goal that the university really wants, they should be ready to put it in 1 year or 2. But they want to put in 6 years or 5 years. And after the 5th year, they can say, look, we did this. And that gives us 6 years of progress reports to write. A lot of time and effort for something that we could have done. And we were basically willing to do it. Not all the teachers were, but we decided to do it. And so SDGs are not a bad idea, but maybe midterm planning is not a great idea. Study abroad, another one. 2 years ago, March, just as Corona was hitting, another teacher and I had to take 15 students to Hawaii. And it was March. So there was news coming out about Corona. It hadn't really hit our prefecture. It hadn't really hit Hawaii, but it seemed like it was going to. And so the other teacher and I kept going to the global center and saying, "You want us to go to Hawaii? I mean, it looks kind of bad." And they said, no, go. And so we did this like 4 or 5 times. And you know, the partner we were in Hawaii, they were like, you don't really need to come, you know? They clearly didn't really want us that much at the time. But we went because our university kept saying, please go. Okay, it is Hawaii, so neither of us were really that upset. But, and I'm kind of lucky we did it because the next 2 years we couldn't go anywhere. But when I got back 3 months later, I was in a meeting and they were talking about their midterm planning goal, 6 years. And I noticed that they got the needed increase in students going abroad on programs. It was 10 students over their target. If we hadn't gone, we wouldn't have met the target. So our 15 students put the university over the target. I'm not saying that's why they chose this, but sometimes you might want to think there are more important goals than strategic planning. And that is one reason why I don't think it's a good idea. Another one, and this is related, is time-limited budgets. And these would be 5 or 6 year time-limited budgets. We could have talked about Global 30, but I'm not going to talk about that. Basically, these two Japanese writers say that the grant and aid scheme works much like the planned economy of the Soviet Union, which we all know was a great success. They say the government makes a plan, the enterprises apply for the funding, and if accepted, they receive a grant and aid. To complete this process, again, going back to an inordinate amount of time, effort, and nervous energy. So much so that actually necessary organizational reforms do not get advanced. And I think one example I can give about the problem with time-limited budgets, and I think a lot of universities suffer from this, is global centers. Global centers came in after all the other departments and centers were created, and a lot of them are working on time-committed budgets. I think the quality of some of the faculty, because they're all on time-limited budgets and they're just there knowing that they're going to go to another university where they can get tenure, is a problem. I think some of the things, they might be on a 5-year time-limited contract, but for 2 years they were hired for a certain goal, and then suddenly there's a new project, and they're still hired for the end of their contract, but the goal might be quite different. So I really don't know if the time-limited budget thing is really effective. Next one, the pernicious effects of top-down managerialist management style. I think this is maybe a little bit into the macro, but anyways, I thought I should say it. Gilpin says that basically neoliberal, and I think what they mean by neoliberal is using business type practices. Managerialist management styles of evaluating research, education, and output. I think we talked about this in other presentations. They're very unpopular with academics and are considered not to lead to positive results. This is just opinion, though. It's not fact that it leads to negative results. But I think academics generally regard managerialism as an extra bureaucratic burden, and the process involved is mere game playing. I think game playing was the word when I read this. I thought, that's what I think I'm involved in sometimes, game play. And I know I have to do this, and if I play this game, something will happen that's good. If I don't play that game, it's not going to work. So I think that is an important point. And just to bring in another Japanese scholar here, I thought this was kind of interesting. This is from a person named Sato, and I just took a picture of it because I didn't know how I was going to present this in class. But basically, he's talking about the PDCA cycle, the plan, do, check, act cycle that so much of us are involved in when we're doing initiatives and reform measures. His idea was that there's a big P, a small d, a big C, and a small a. There's a lot of planning, not much doing, A lot of checking and not much action. So he said it's 95% planning, 5% action. I'm not sure how he came up with that number, but you can also see that in the end, you're just passing the problem on to whatever next project has a PDCA cycle. So didn't really have a good anecdote for this, but I do think that English language test scores can be described like this, where I've been trying to tell people at my universities that, first of all, English language test scores don't actually measure your English ability. They do to some extent, but they really don't. And if you're only going with a 2-skill test and you want definite results, your curriculum is going to be a 2-skill curriculum. Is that what you want? But if we're on a PDCA cycle, maybe that's what you get. Another one is an over-reliance on transfer approaches to change. And this one I took from Ashwin. He's talking about transforming university education. And he says new initiatives are often introduced through generously funded pilots. Think of maybe the Global 30. That others are encouraged to then adopt. This is a very weak theory of change, which has been labeled the contagious theory of change. A personal example about this, I've been involved in making English language lounges. And I sort of agree with the idea of English language lounges. But how did I start planning to make an English language lounge? Did I go to a university that has just a so-so language lounge? No, I went to the best, which at the time was Kinky University. We have a big English village there, and a lot of money. I met the woman who ran it. I don't know if she still runs it, but she told us her budget. Whoa, never get that. And so, and then the next 2 universities, I planned English language lounges. They're not bad. I'm proud of them. They're definitely not the English village at Kinky University. And they're very difficult to run. So in this case, it's a personal reflection that maybe thinking of places where you're well funded and then applying them to places where you're not well funded is not the correct way to do things. And maybe we shouldn't just copy other universities, but find something for our own university that matches. How much more do we have? Do we have much more time?
You have about about 5 minutes,
Oh,
and then we have the rest of the time for Q&A until 5:40.
Okay. I'm getting pretty close to that. Okay. The lack of actual evidence-based program evaluation. This one, I'm not going to go through in detail, but I will say, for example, Jarvis talking something about quality assurance regulating higher education. He said the effectiveness of quality assurance regimes is typically a matter of conviction rather than evidence-based policy determination. It's not just quality assurance regimes, but I think there's a real weakness, particularly in Japan, of really looking at data. And I won't talk much about this because it's actually 3 years ago. I gave a presentation that's actually this conference. It's sort of related to this, where the title was Creating a Better Learning Experience Through Program Evaluation, where we actually, as a group, we went through all the data together and tried to improve our program. You can see that on YouTube through Lakeland University if you're interested. So I won't say anything more about that section, but I do think there's a weakness there. Final, it's a bit of my pet peeve. The over-dependence on so-called higher education scholars. Now, I actually went on sabbatical once and got a master's degree in higher education studies, so I'm sort of 1 foot in that field. some extent, but I still feel there are problems with this. Anyways, Hata said several problems with higher education studies in Japan. He said that there's a lack of higher education focused graduate schools to train well-rounded researchers. I think Hiroshima is one of them, but I think there's only really 3 or 4 in Japan that actually train well-rounded researchers. They actually have a graduate program in higher education studies. The difficulty with balance between research, teaching, and office work. You do all research, then you aren't doing teaching, you have no practical ties to the classroom. Focus now on translating vague policies and indefinite visions into reforms. I think this might be one of the biggest problems, is that it seems to be that higher education researchers at particular universities view the role of taking the next programs and turning them into a reality, rather than looking at issues within your own organization. We should be focusing more on meta-analysis, and there's a real difficulty with research integrity for higher education scholars. If you do something and you say it succeeded, you can publish that, and you look better. If you do something and it fails, and you publish that, you can't publish it. So you sort of, there's a research integrity problem here. Sato says, and I agree, but many higher education researchers in Japan simply are lacking in research literacy. I don't think they've been trained in it. And that many surveys touted its evidence are junk data or garbage. These are his words, not mine, but I sort of understand what he's saying. And finally, this is something that I picked up from one of the universities I worked at previously, where they came up with a PDA cycle. And I thought, that's a little bit rude, the way they came up with this PDA cycle. They said, this is what we do at the higher education center. So the P, you'll notice, the higher education center decides what the P is. They do the planning. The do is the teachers. The C is the higher education center, and the act is the teachers. And I showed this to other teachers and said, that's really rude. What do they think? We just do what they say. And I was really surprised because nobody really mentioned this in the meeting. Nobody said, well, wait a minute, isn't this a little bit strange? Aren't we involved as teachers in the P and the C? I suppose they could say, yeah, but we're just talking about what higher education center does, but still, seems to be a problem there. Actually, the bigger macro issues might be in Japan, what is a university? What's it there for? And also just the influence of text. It's just always there. This is the last slide, but basically, what I think is when you have reforms and they don't work, and all the teachers know they're going wrong, the teachers shout SOS. What is SOS? SOS is subterfuge, obfuscation, and sabotage. That basically you are demotivating teachers if these reform measures go wrong. And a lot of teachers do, and I notice teachers look at ways to avoid reforms because they know that they're going to be troublesome, they're going to be extra paperwork, and they're not going to lead to great successes. So I've never been one of those, but I saw some of my colleagues come this way. They're very jaded and cynical about reforms. So I think we should work a little harder on it. I don't know if you and I will have any effect on it, but if we sort of know about it, things will be better. And that's it for me. Thank you.
So we have a little over 10 minutes if we want to go to discussion, Q&A. If anybody, like Rod was saying before, we can end the day, ask our researchers questions as they like. So the floor is open.
I have a comment